Suella Braverman may be out of government, but former Prime Minister David Cameron is back in. Now, it was a fairly surprising move from Rishi Sunak, as Cameron is no longer an MP and so had to be given a life peerage on the spot. This was Sky's commentary as David Cameron walked into Number 10 to accept his new job.
There have been stories in the last few days that David Cameron, who had never really found his feet after leaving the job of Prime Minister, did jobs that were controversial, wrote a memoir, but never put on weight.
It's a sort of bizarre low blow from Kay Burley there. Put on weight. She was interrupting as her colleague Sam Coates explained what Cameron had been up to since leaving his job as Prime Minister. And that included making £7 million as a lobbyist for Greensill Capital. Cameron had personally texted Rishi Sunak to try to help Greensill secure COVID loans before the company went bust. One could say that that scandal tarnished Cameron's previous record in government, but there's not much of a record to defend or to tarnish. Now, a 2017 study from UCL suggested Cameron's signature policy, so austerity, was linked to 120,000 excess deaths in England. And it was Cameron's decision to hold a Brexit referendum without making any preparations for Brexit, which led to years of political chaos after 2016. And on foreign policy, the area of Cameron's new brief, he didn't exactly excel. His biggest decision was to send British planes to take out Gaddafi in 2011, leading to state collapse and civil war. A 2016 parliamentary report concluded this Libyan intervention based on erroneous assumptions. David Cameron ultimately responsible. That's from the Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Ash, why is this happening now? Why is David Cameron back at the forefront of British politics?
Well, I was trying to work it out from David Cameron's perspective, and the only thing I can really think of is that he's quite sincere about wanting to save the Conservative Party, in his view, from the sort of populist vandalism of the likes of Suella Braverman. Now, that doesn't mean that he's some beacon of decency, far from it, as we're about to discuss. But that's the only reason why I can think he would want to put himself in a place where he has to declare his register of interests and where he's making his money from. Because as we have seen, and as we'll discuss in a bit, he has spent the intervening years since his time in office doing an awful lot of lobbying in ways which I think could be considered a little bit shady. In terms of why this is happening now, this is all to do with the balance of power within the Conservative Party and where Rishi Sunak is able to draw support. So one of the biggest problems facing him is that no Conservative who's ambitious about their career wants to take one of the big offices of state right now, because they see it as attaching themselves to a sinking ship. And it means that after there is presumably a Keir Starmer government and the Conservatives are in opposition, that they won't be able to position themselves as a change candidate for leadership or shadow cabinet. You've got the problem of the Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Common Sense Group type constellation of MPs, who you'd broadly characterise as low-tax, anti-trans headbangers. Now, these are people who've been dedicated to undermining Rishi Sunak's personal authority for quite some time. Suella Braverman had kind of been, their tribune, their woman on the inside, carrying out a bit of a wrecking operation. And I think she came to the conclusion that now it was time to be a backbench martyr rather than being seen as part of a failing Rishi Sunak government. So what does that leave him with? Well, it leaves him with what often called the moderate wing of the Conservative Party, though of course when it came to austerity and foreign policy, they were anything but. What we can fairly describe them as is the technocratic wing of the Conservative Party. While they were quite happy to smash the public sector and North Africa to pieces, they didn't want to hugely change the way in which the government functions. They don't want to really change the constitutional settlement of the UK. They don't want to muck about with things like ECHR or, when it was the case, membership of the EU. And that's not Rishi Sunak's most comfortable place to be. So one of the warning signs for Cameron back in 2016 when the referendum was being called was that, at the time, a newly minted MP by the name of Rishi Sunak, young, ambitious, career-driven, didn't want to be seen on the Remain side. So politics does make strange bedfellows. The fact that this has sort of come round full circle, Rishi Sunak is now relying on David Cameron to shore up his government. It's emblematic of the dearth of options that he's got, because no one wants to be a minister. If they do, they want to take Rishi Sunak's head off. That means that he had to go beyond the green benches of the House of Commons just to find someone who could do the job.
Wondering if it is about the future of the Conservative Party more than policy or anything else, because I mean, there's clearly a plan by the hard right of the Conservative Party. Now, you know, as you say, economically, George Osborne and Cameron were about as hard right as it gets. But in terms of sort of stoking culture wars, for example, they weren't as passionate as the Suella Bravermans of the world. There is clearly a very organised, sustained campaign on the sort of cultural right, you could say, of the Conservative Party, sort of via GB News, via Suella Braverman. They are intending to take over the Conservative Party after the next general election. And, you know, they've got a good chance of doing it. Now, presumably, there are many people in the Conservative Party who don't want that to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if Rishi Sunak was one of them. You know, he is also very right-wing, but he does have sort of technocratic edges. I don't think he's too comfortable in the sort of GB News style mode of politics. And it might be the case that by putting David Cameron in there, you know that the Tories are going to lose the next general election. But what you want to do is maintain as big a section of your vote share as you can, and you want the kind of voters that you want to shape the future of the Conservative Party, right? So if they think that it's from the red wall, now obviously there's lots of sort of assumptions going on here, but if you think it's sort of that move to the Boris Johnson style Conservative Party, which was a bit more sort of culturally right-wing. I don't think Boris Johnson was that culturally right-wing, but he was obviously more open to promoting people who were. If that's sort of your red wall base, and David Cameron is much more your sort of rich liberal base, they might be competing with Liberal Democrat voters in some of those, I think they're called the blue wall seats, aren't they? So maybe by putting David Cameron there, you're saying our next general election, we're going to lose anyway, but we want our core vote to be rich liberals as opposed to being social conservatives. And that will potentially mean that the next time there is a Tory leadership election after Rishi Sunak stands down, the sensibles, I think, as they like to think of themselves, will keep the party as opposed to the GB News lot. That's kind of the only sense I can make of this. I don't think it's because of David Cameron's foreign policy now, which, as we've said, is not too impressive a record. And as a bunch of people have pointed out on Twitter today, there will be lots of European leaders who aren't particularly happy to welcome David Cameron for talks because they think he caused Brexit with his sort of naivety and has left the country in a bit of a state. From his perspective, I think his legacy is terrible, right? Austerity, which everyone seems to agree is bad now, right? We should have borrowed when interest rates were low. Now we have terrible productivity and interest rates are high. It was a huge, huge missed opportunity. Of course, because Cameron is not an MP, he will not be able to be questioned by MPs in the usual manner in the House of Commons. And Commons Speaker Lindsay Hoyle has said he is looking into how Cameron can be held to account by elected representatives. Now, I'm not convinced these things make too much difference to policy. Whenever Lindsay Hoyle sort of comes out with these big grandstanding statements, I'm never too interested. And especially in the case of Israel-Palestine, I think the policy is pretty much set in the White House anyway. Which is interesting because on Israel-Palestine, Cameron has made some interesting past statements. So he said, everybody knows that we are not going to sort out the problem in the Middle East peace process while there is effectively a giant open prison in Gaza. So that was in 2010. And so he'd just become Prime Minister, saying that in the House of Commons. A month later, this time in Ankara, Turkey, he said the situation in Gaza has to change. Humanitarian goods and people must flow in both directions. Gaza cannot and must not be allowed to remain a prison camp. And then in 2016, he said to the House of Commons, what this government has consistently done and gone on doing is saying, yes, we are supporters of Israel, but we do not support illegal settlements. We do not support what is happening in East Jerusalem. And it's very important that this capital city is maintained in the way that it was in the past. So he's talking there about sort of the encirclement of Palestinian East Jerusalem by lots and lots of settlements. Basically, they're trying to pressure the Palestinians out, as you see in sort of the incidents in Sheikh Jarrah, where they're basically forcing out Palestinian residents and replacing them with Jewish ones. Now, does this matter? Is this going to change British policy when it comes to Israel-Palestine? I would say no, for a couple of reasons. One, as I said, policy is essentially made in the White House when it comes to this issue, when it comes to the Middle East and Westminster. But two, what David Cameron is saying there is pretty much what every politician has said for the past few decades, right? Every politician says they're against settlements. George W. Bush said he was against settlements. Barack Obama said he was against settlements. And then what do? They just give Israel unconditional support anyway. They say, oh, we're giving them all these arms, we're giving them all these weapons, we're giving them all this financial support, but we have asked them nicely not to do settlements. Now, unless you as a politician are willing to put conditions on military support, unless you are willing to threaten sanctions, for example, for the consistent breach of international law, which is settlement expansion, then sort of saying these things to me is completely irrelevant. So I think David Cameron, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, when it comes to Russia-Ukraine, is basically just going to be, establishment policy as usual. I can't really see any changes coming there, and I don't think it's going to be particularly impacted by whether or not MPs are able to question him in the House of Commons. This is very much uni-party territory, isn't it? The Tories and Labour very much in agreement when it comes to Israel-Palestine. Israel are our allies, and so therefore we're fairly relaxed about Palestinian kids getting killed every day.